I'm going to continue our journey. We're looking at tools that support resilience as we face the new hard times that we're in. And I'm seeing a range there from supporting nieces to supporting grandchildren, supporting people in organizations experiencing burnout, supporting community. There's a range of contexts. And in each of those, you can look at a storyboard. What I mean by a storyboard is that it's a way of mapping out elements of a story. And while we're still on this question, what would a story of resilience look like here? We're still on our second tool. Um, I find that even just a short form storyboard where I start with here's me facing this, which is about acknowledging, and then what helps here is. Or if you're supporting someone else, it might be here's you facing this. And let's look together at what might help you in this situation. Or if it's collective resilience, it may be here's us facing this, naming the challenge, the adversity that we face, and then having a conversation around what helps here is, and supporting each other to engage in those helping practices and processes together. So I want to move on to really also exploring what helps. And I've mentioned already that one thing that helps is acknowledging the adversity you face. And so I want to bring in another tool here. This is a third tool. The third tool is a graph. And the third tool really is about a way of helping yourself acknowledge the adversity. And there's a question that comes here, which is which zone of challenge am I in? And I find it very helpful to think of three zones of challenge. There's some challenges which I can be completely unfazed by, I can deal with quite easily. And I think of that as my comfort zone or green zone, things that are easy. But there are also some challenges that stretch me in a manageable way. Like I may come out in a bit of a sweat, may feel my pulse racing, but I may at the end of the day think, oh, that was a busy day. It was a bit stressful, but I got through it okay. And I'm kind of find it satisfying. It's where we can learn most when we're on our growth edge. But I also want to acknowledge that there's a line that we can cross that takes us into a more extreme challenge that we can experience feeling overwhelmed, defeated, threatened, in danger, at risk. And this is what I mean by the red zone of challenge. And I'm just going to invite you to consider what zone of challenge you've been in over the last few weeks. You might think, well, okay, I'm mostly here, but I've been a bit there. And I do this when I'm working with teams, when I'm working with groups. And what I find is that it gives people a language to signal to each other when they need help. It might be, okay, yes, it's difficult at the moment, but I'm feeling orange. I'm doing okay. But there can also be times where people say, I'm in the red zone. And that's a time where we need to really pay attention to each other and say, okay, tell me more about that. Tell me what you need. I'd love to show up and help. That if we can be there for each other when we're in our red zone moments, and including hearing from people that actually they may not want to be a lot of help at that time and to respect that too. But one of the key things about this graph is that the zone of challenge we're in is not just dependent on the degree of the challenge. It's also linked to our capacity to deal with it, and that capacity can grow. So, linked to this three zones of challenge is also the idea of the growth mindset. Some of you may be familiar with this. Some people look at resilience as something that some people have and others don't. They might think lucky people, those rare, exceptional individuals who've got the resilience gene. But actually, the research doesn't show that. The research can shows that actually people can be surprised by their own resilience, how it can kind of pop out of nowhere, and that we can start a situation not feeling very resilient, but engage in a process of finding that which helps us in a way that I think is more like a sort of row of frames in a movie film than a fixed picture. So if people say, oh, it's not in the picture, I'm not going to be able to deal with that, or I'm a kind of stress intolerant person, I can't see myself, learning how to deal with this. The growth mindset is really about recognizing that resilience is something that we can develop from any starting point. one of the things I like about this is that sometimes we can grow in our ability to deal with challenge, but sometimes we can give ourselves permission to step back. And while habitual avoidance can cause problems, that we don't develop the confidence to deal with challenges if we always step back from them, to give ourselves an opt-out clause is really about assertiveness. Assertiveness is a skill that's got proven mental health benefits. That when we learn ways of giving ourselves the option of stepping back, and particularly something that I invite people to do is what I call the flu test. The flu test is when you're really struggling to look at what's on your agenda of things that you kind of feel you need to do, and just ask yourself the question, would I do this if I had the flu? And when we're really in the red zone, we need to give ourselves permission to step back from some areas of challenge, to say, these are not ordinary conditions, that these are extreme conditions where I need to have a different set of operating principles, where I don't just carry on with business as usual, but I recognize that I need to step into a new story. And that's what I mean by the story of Throughtopia, the story of finding a way through. So before I move into looking at the next tool, I just want to acknowledge that there's some number of comments in the chat window, and just invite in Madeline. Madeline, is there anything you want to report in from the chat window?
Yes, so people have been sharing about which zones we've been feeling in. And one thing that's interesting is there's quite a lot of movement, and also people identifying some of the stress factors that have perhaps pushed them into red, and then some of the things that have enabled movement back into the orange. Um, and also just backtracking a little bit to when people were talking about their stories of resilience, there was really quite a theme that came up where people were making the links between the three levels and between the me, you, and us. So people saying that they wanted to support their own resilience so that they could support the you level and the us level. So really kind of interweaving those three levels.
Fantastic. And I think that's the thing. It's not, that these things are completely separate, but one of the big factors in resilience is context. And so, for example, when you've got a community with what's been called high levels of social capital, which is really about a rich web of relationships, people not only have lower levels of depression, lower levels of suicide, they also have lower levels of crime and lower levels of heart disease too. That we're looking at the relationship between our community resilience and personal resilience. And that's why I really like this me, you, and us framing of resilience, because I think that there's a danger if we see that resilience is a kind of solo story, that it's all about me being strong, facing that, rather than there's a lovely saying in recovery groups. I worked a long time in addictions recovery field in the health service with groups of people, and there was a saying, I can't, we can. I can't, we can. And there are some resilience challenges that are bigger than we are, and we need to join together to face them. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to our next our tool. And so we're collecting some tools that we can apply in the stories of resilience that we play a part in. We're active players in these stories. And so some of you, anyone who's really worked with me, might have come across some of these tools before. And by the way to really get to grips with these tools is to revisit them often. And so if there's some of this you think, I've heard this before, there's different levels of knowing. One is, well, do I know about it? But another level is, do I practically use this? And how well do I practically use this? We can refine something. Let me just think of something like mindfulness practice. You might do the same practice again and again, but through training and repeated practice, you shift to a deeper level with it. And it's the same really with areas of skillfulness, that when you repeat them, when you keep coming back to them, you can inhabit them, use them, apply them at a deeper level. And I think this particularly with this diagram here, this is our fourth tool, and it's called the spider diagram of radical uncertainty. And that phrase, radical uncertainty, I learned from my friend, teacher, co-author of Active Hope, Joanna Macy. And it's really about acknowledging that wherever we are, whatever we face, however we feel, it can go different ways. We don't know what's going to happen. There's that radical uncertainty. There's better ways it can go. There's worse ways it can go. And in the Penn Resilience program developed at the University of Pennsylvania, they have something similar where they ask or invite people to ask three questions. They say, what's the best that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? What's most likely to happen? And what that does is, I don't know if any of you get this, but I get this sometimes, that when things go wrong, there's part of my brain that gets really fixated on that question, what's the worst that can happen here? And there's a term here, catastrophizing, where you kind of get stuck on a kind of like a horror movie unfolding in your mind. And it's important to acknowledge the worst. That's what fire safety drills are based on, people being paid money to ask the question, what's the worst that can happen here? But then look at ways of making that less likely or less harmful. But also this other side of this is what's the best that can happen, whatever you face. And I'm guessing some of you might have had the experience of facing something very difficult at a point back in your past that actually turned out much better than you thought it would at the time. And those are really about stories of resilience, our own stories of resilience. And a phrase I love is maybe I'll surprise myself. Maybe we'll surprise ourselves. That and I find this hand thing very helpful. It was a past student on one of the resilience courses, Lynn, who said she did this with children, those questions. She'd say, what's the best? Thumbs up. What's the worst? What's most likely? And just to use your hand this way is you're reminding yourself that whatever you face can go different ways. And I call this pathways of possibility. The spider diagram is reminding us of pathways of possibility. It's about inhabiting a state of possibility so that even when things go badly wrong, when things take a turning for the worse, you know that even from when things are going down here, even from this low point, there's still different ways it can go. And it does involve a recalibration around what we think of as the best. It's what's the best from here. And this is why I think this session is important, because when we hold the question, facing the new hard times, what helps me here, we're acknowledging that there have been some turnings for the worse. We're acknowledging that. And rather than just remaining with the hopes that may have felt appropriate 10 or 20 years ago, we're entering a new set of circumstances where we need to recalibrate that around what's the best that can happen from here. But we can still head that way. And I think of that as a two-part story. So if we come back to an earlier tool, our second tool is the question, what does a story of resilience look like here? We can look at that story again and say, well, here's me facing this, that's a downslope. And what helps here is, and I find very helpful the words acceptance and commitment. And there's a whole approach to therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is really based around accepting what how things are, but also saying, well, what's the commitment that I bring to this? And my commitment is really to see how I can find and follow the better legs of the spider, the better ways that things can go. I want to move on to a next tool. And I learned about this tool over 35 years ago when I was a medical student in London from Professor Patrick Pietroni, a pioneer of the holistic approach, who said that health is a bit like rowing along in a little boat, and illness is a bit like your boat crashing into a rock. And doctors, I was training to be a medical doctor, very involved in knowing all about rocks that people can crash into. Doctors are a bit like geologists, or psychologists are a bit like they know about the psychological rocks that you can crash into. And as well as the rock, there's also the water level. which is like the background level of resilience, the background level of well-being. And there's an important insight that our resilience can fluctuate. We can have days where we're better able to cope and days where we struggle more. And so it's really useful to consider what are the times when we struggle more. I tend to cope less well when might be after I haven't slept well, when I've been exceptionally busy, when I've not been eating well, when I've been sitting for long periods of time and I haven't had a chance to stretch and move my body. And so, what we're doing with resilience is being aware of the downward arrows, but also looking at what we can bring to that. What are the upward arrows? I tend to cope better when. I'm going to invite you to take this image away with you. Take this image away with you and we haven't got time just now, but if you're listening to the recording, you might just pause and just consider what are the downward arrows for me that I tend to struggle more when? What are the things that push my resilience level down? But also, what are the times I tend to cope better? What pushes my resilience levels up? Because if we can give attention to the upward arrows, they have a buffering effect. They have a protective effect. And one of the kind of qualities in resilience is where you have a degree of buoyancy that keeps you afloat, even when there might be rough weather with the waves rising and falling. You're not sunk by the waves rising and falling. You rise and fall with conditions, with a kind of like this image of a cork floating on the water. And so to become really interested in buoyancy, what supports your buoyancy that protects you from sinking? Because when we sink, one kind of type of sinking is a depression, which depression is levels of antidepressant prescribing have been massively rising in recent years. And one of the commonest types of group of antidepressants is known as the SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. But I want to repurpose those letters and think of them as related to strategies, strengths, resources, and insights. And I think of this as the resilience toolkit, the resilience SSRI or self-help toolkit, perhaps, or um, where we're looking at different groups of upward arrows, different types of resilience tools, that there are strategies, strengths, resources, and insights, and that you might take away this too as a framework to develop, thinking about strategies are practical things you do. What are your favorite strategies? Strengths you draw upon within yourself. You might think of a time where you've got through something difficult and reflect on what are the strengths you drew upon that helped you do that. You might think of resources you turn to. What are the resources that make a difference to you? And resources can include places, people, pets, can include books or websites or groups that you belong to. And so it's thinking what resources your resilience? What are the root system that you draw in nourishment from? And then insights are guiding ideas, the sense of when I think like this, it steers me in a particular direction. And how can we have guiding thoughts, guiding insights, guiding perspectives that support our growing in resilience? Now, I've just given an overview here, and I want to name a role in the story of resilience that I see as really much needed in our times, and it's the role of the resilience practitioner. And I'm recognizing that I'm speaking to resilience practitioners now. What I mean by a resilience practitioner is someone who engages in practices to support and nourish resilience. But there's also something here. If we think about us as engage in practices to support and nourish resilience, if we think of the different levels of the story, there's me, there's you, and there's us. So engaging in practice to support my own resilience, that's the me level. Engage in practices that support resilience in someone else. It may be informally, a friend or family member. It may be professionally if you're a coach or helping professional of another kind, or a teacher or a member of a team where you're supporting others. And that we collectively need to upskill ourselves in these resilience understandings, resilience practices, and think of that resilience toolkit. How can we help each other grow in the strategies available to us, in the strengths that we draw upon, in the resources that we turn to and have access to, and in the insights, the resilience wisdom that guides us? I I see my role as training resilience practitioners, and I have a number of different resilience courses, but I do want to mention one that is starting next week. I have a resilience practitioner training that I've been running since 2015. We've had hundreds of people go through this training now, and I've got one starting next week on the 22nd of May. And if you miss that one, I do have a recorded version of this course available. And I also tend to run it each October as well. And it consists of 8 90-minute webinars, an online learning platform where I've got a collection of interviews I've done with leading practitioners and also accompanying video tutorials as well. But also, to be a practitioner, you need to practice. So each week we have a practice that we invite people to try out and then reflect on and talk about together as a group. If you want to become a certified resilience practitioner, this course offers a pathway to that and is recognized by the Association for Coaching for 20 hours of CPD, continuing professional development points. But that's the sharing that I'd like to offer. I want to point people to my website at collegeofwellbeing.com. If you'd like to find out more, if you'd like to be part of this resilience practitioner journey too, and also be developing this as a field, that we really need to recruit and train so many more resilience practitioners, because with that rising level of distress and it being reasonably foreseeable that more difficult times are still to come, this is a quality and an area of skillfulness that is so needed in our time.